All right, it's time for another vlog about making a movie. First, a couple of updates. I recently applied to a grant at the Austin Film Society. I applied for $12,000 for production and finishing funds. I also put together a pitch packet recently and tested it out on some good friends of mine who have gone through this process a couple of times. And there were some hilarious results there, some great feedback that I'm gonna have to work in. But again, I'll touch on that in another episode as I get deeper into fundraising. The biggest update right now is that I'm almost finished with the second draft of the script. It's come a long way, and this is where the real work begins. Rewriting, at least for me, is really where I find the story and more importantly, the characters. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. Rewriting in screenplays is hugely important. A lot of movies are really found in rewrites. Stanley Kubrick was writing a tense Cold War thriller when he realized that everything happening in the movie and the premise itself was so absurd that his movie was actually a comedy, and it turned into Dr. Strangelove. That's where he found all those characters, everything that they were saying. You can't fight in here, gentlemen, this is the war room. All of that, a lot of this stuff was in the original draft, but he realized by turning it on its head that he could explore some of these ideas a lot better than trying to keep this tense structure in the thriller format. The original draft of the Star Wars, I believe, had big sections about Luke's story with his cousin, and a lot more about his family dynamics were happening on Tatooine. Even though it didn't make it into the final film, I can imagine all of that helped George Lucas figure out who Luke was. It's really important work to do to figure out the characters, do that foundational background work. And that's really what I'm doing in this draft. I'm reading a book right now called The Art of Dramatic Writing by Lajos Egri. Probably didn't pronounce that name right. But he really focuses on character, and he argues against Aristotle, who said that a story starts with plot and that plot drives the story. But he argues that character drives the plot. And I've run into a lot of issues with my first draft because when I come up with the movies in my head as they're playing, I often see them more like a dream. I'll see maybe up to like 20 minutes of a finished film, but I'll see the entire span of it. I see a lot of the first act and the third act, and the second act comes in little wisps and character moments. And then when I go to write that down, I'm just connecting that fabric, and it turns into essentially fleshing out a plot. And that's okay to get the engine working, but what happens is that your plot is driving the film and essentially your characters are in the back seat just hanging on for dear life. And in the case of my film, that meant that my characters were a little flaccid. They were just, and they were on the same side too often. They were just good buddies hanging out. In order to have them go through this huge life change that really needs to happen to explore the themes I want to explore, I need them to be in conflict with each other, with my other characters, and internally. So how do I get my characters out of the backseat and into the front? Let me run through the film just to remind you of kind of where I was. My two main characters are Anuj and Merrick. Anuj is taking a forced sabbatical from his graduate school after making some major mistakes there. He's come back to his hometown and he's reunited with his best friend from childhood, Merrick, who's living in his dad's garage. And together the two create this new drug that thrusts them into an entirely new reality. The first draft of the script was really just fleshing out all of that. But for this draft, I really had to go back after dragging these characters along through this movie. I had to go back and ask, who are these people? I know what needs to happen essentially, and that can happen in a lot of ways, but I need to find out how that happens through the characters. So what type of person would make this choice to create this drug in the first place? If I've got a guy who likes his future Anuj to essentially create this illegal drug in an illegal setting with an old friend of his. Most biochemistry students 2 years into their graduate work would not do that. That is going to answer a lot of questions about who Anuj is. He needs to be conflicted going in. He needs to have parts of his life that are not fulfilled yet. He needs to be searching for something that this drug can fulfill. And then also importantly, how would the events in this film affect them and fulfill their destinies? Here are some of the things I found in this rewrite. Anuj is the one who really is driving this along, and Merrick is experiencing it all. He's the test rat. So who is Anuj? Why would this guy risk everything to create a drug and help his friend get into this new reality? Well, the very source of his ambition and his drive to succeed is the source of his conflict with his mother. His mother wants him to be a doctor. She sees working in a lab on chemistry as hiding away and almost a selfish act. He's hiding away, he's not doing anything that's directly impacting people's lives, and she really wants him to make a positive impact on society. One scene in the original script has really turned into one of his major subplots. We follow his mother trying to get him to use this year off to redirect his life and to go into medical school. Not wanting to disappoint his mom, he ends up lying to her about the process. So he strings her along, telling her, yes, I'm going to follow this, you're right. And that comes to a head later at a crucial point. He really needs to prove to himself and to his mother that, that he is a success. And when he doesn't find that with his mother, he turns to his old chemistry professor, who is another key character in the main plot of discovering and developing this drug. So he looks for validation through his professor, who is genuinely stunned and impressed by this work. But the professor wants him to clean up the work, get rid of all traces of the drug from this work and make it essentially about these key chemistry components where he's found real breakthroughs. Well, this is where the main conflict with Merrick comes from. Anuj stumbles across a huge breakthrough that opens up the possibilities of this drug, and without telling Anuj, Merrick takes the drug. Early on, the consequences seem like they're not going to be too dire. When the professor comes in, he illuminates some key problems with this drug that threaten to kill Merrick. So who is Merrick? Merrick lives in his dad's garage. That's where this takes place, and really it's very necessary to this movie because for $50,000 I can't have them all over the place. I can't be shooting in an expensive laboratory. So this was kind of a production restriction on this story, but I loved the idea of the American innovators taking the next leap in human technological evolution in their garage. I think that's a great story in our culture. So knowing that, it imposes some really interesting character quirks on Merrick, and I think really dictates a lot of who he is. This mid-20s guy lives in his garage. So either he's not intelligent enough to get into college and go out there, or he doesn't have the drive, or he's happy where he is. Well, I don't want him to be happy where he is, because that doesn't make for an interesting story. And he's not unintelligent because he needs to be asking these interesting existential questions. So that means that he doesn't have the drive to get out there and to make something of himself, or he has no purpose. He doesn't know what to do. His dad becomes a central character. And again, in the first iteration of the script, there was just kind of one scene to spice things up and to get a particular plot mechanism moving. So his dad was essentially a plot device. But his dad has become a much more interesting character. They have intense conflict. They really dislike each other. His dad is living with his girlfriend in the house, and there are a bunch of deadbolts on the door from the garage into the house. Merrick has walled himself off in here, and he wants nothing to do with them. Why is that? I realized early on that his mom was gone, And for a long time, I was writing with the assumption that his mom had died, giving him this hole in his life. And while that was interesting, later on in the script, as I was writing a scene that was going to be this touching scene where he remembered his lost mother, I realized that the entire relationship with his father could be flipped on its head if instead of being dead, the mom had left. The mom had left the family when Merrick was a child, and he's always been searching for why. And his dad uses that against him. And I think that much better explains why Merrick is going to do some of the things he does at the end of this film. So now, knowing where Merrick is coming from, that gives his relationship with Anuj more clarity and makes it much more interesting and develops the conflict in ways that I could never have seen before. Merrick relies on Anuj in a really foundational way, not only for the meaning and excitement in his life, but also as the only source of love. And love has become a really important key to the plot of this movie and to the drug itself. Psychedelic drugs in particular are not a one-lane highway. They can go in a lot of ways, and a lot of that depends on what's going on inside of you, what emotions you haven't dealt with. The complex feelings toward love that Merrick has, and the lack of it, really creates the engine for the second act, for him to fumble through this drug experience. And as it gets more intense, it gets worse, and forces him to explore his past and to come to terms with who he was in order for him to take the leap into becoming who he will be. That love is one-sided for a lot of the film, and it takes Anuj making a key decision on what Merrick means to him in order to finally unlock the full potential of this drug and get this plot to its climax. So that was a lot. I really retooled the entire script. All right, that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. If you've made it this deep, I'll be doing a fundraising episode in the next month or so be looking out for that. And until then, here's a box.